going to keep it up?
Oh, yes, I can stop sharing, yes. Oh, geez.
Okay. Now we started recording. Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Hello, guapa. Adios. Adios, adios.
Good afternoon.
Adios.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Adios.
And welcome to this year's Critical Studies in Television Conference. As we were saying before we got going, this is a slow conference, and I think this is a good way to go because I'm sure many of you have tried to attend a conference that goes back to back to back. I was doing it last week and giving papers due to time differences at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I think this is a good model, and I really hope that it works. It'd be interesting to hear your feedback. It's also very unusual weather here in Europe at the moment, and I know some of you have experienced flooding and very heavy rain. Today in the United Kingdom, it is the hottest day of the year. So if you are in the UK, I really invite you to take your device outside, get a cold drink, sit in the shade and sit back and enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. So as Alka said, my name is Professor Jo Crotty. I'm Professor of Management and I'm also Director of the Institute of Social Responsibility here at Edge Hill. The Institute promotes, supports and engages in research and knowledge exchange that captures the widest conceptualization of social responsibility. And so when we were approached by Alka to support and promote this conference, we enthusiastically agreed. Not least because television is many things, a way to wind down, a place from which to obtain information, to be entertained, challenged, and sometimes for society to be reflected back at us, which in turn then prompts our own reflection. Over the last 18 months, television has also become a way to pass acres of time, and I'm sure for many it's become a form of solace and company. Television, however, is not my field of academic inquiry, but I am a huge devourer of it, both TV drama and documentaries, and I am by any standards a world-class binge watcher. There is very little I haven't watched, except The Wire, because I've watched the first episode 3 times and I just can't get past it. But because of this, during lockdown 1, I was asked by a number of friends and colleagues to supply lists on various platforms and channels of things to watch. And so I was very intrigued at some of the sessions that are coming up over the next few weeks, not least the paper on binge watching by Robert Watts. On reading the title, I couldn't help but wonder, do some narratives lend themselves more to binging than others? Do writers set out with the binge watcher in mind, or do they see each episode as standalone? Does it change how the narrative is constructed when you're not asking the viewers to wait for months to find out what happens after, say, Captain Picard utters his famous line, "I am Locutus of Borg"? In the same session, John Ellis's paper on streamers and disruptors also raises some very interesting, if different, questions. Certainly the budgets and creative freedom that streamers provide offer many opportunities, but can this be too much of a good thing? Certainly Glee creators Ryan Murphy's deal with Netflix has failed to produce the TV gold that such freedom and money has promised. Later on in the conference, Clarissa Smith examines the entrance of catchphrases from television into common parlance, focusing on "winter is coming" from Game of Thrones. I myself of late have found myself using the phrase "you know nothing," also from Game of Thrones, in describing the commentary of Ned Boulting at the Tour de France. My sister and I have also shortened the sofa scene on the stairs from Friends to a single pivot when we want someone on TV to shut up. So I'm intrigued to find out how these phrases and just how many of them enter common parlance in this way. I was also drawn to the title of Tom Hemingway's paper on the session about quality on August the 2nd, where he cites some very well-known anti-heroes: Soprano, Draper, open brackets, Whitman, close brackets, and Underwood. But he misses the greatest anti-hero of all time, White, at least in my opinion. No doubt Tom will let us know why. So I could go on and talk about every session, but suffice to say, this little overview indicates that there's much to get your teeth into over the coming weeks. And so I really encourage you to take full advantage of this slow methodology and really dip into those sessions. But before all of that, we start the conference today with our opening keynote. Our speaker is Kristen Warner. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama. She is the author of Cultural Politics of Colorblind TV Casting, and her research interests are centred at the juxtaposition of racial representation and its place within the film and television industry as it concerns labour and employment. She has also published widely, including the Los Angeles Review of Books and Film Quarterly. When I found out that Kristen was going to be our speaker this afternoon, I was reminded that Grey's Anatomy was famously, and to much fanfare, cast blind ahead of its original pilot, and has done much to challenge stereotypes in its casting over its 17-year broadcast history. Yet, when I was revisiting its older cousin, ER, during lockdown, I was reminded that while likely not cast blind, in its first season, the chief of surgery was played by Black actress CCH Pounder, and the most ambitious and able surgical resident by Black actor Eric LaSalle. At the time, I paid this no attention, and I just thought they were great performances. But 20 years later, am I, the viewer, now looking at this through a slightly different lens? No doubt Kristen has thoughts on this and related issues, and so I'll now hand back to our conference organiser, Elke Weissman from Edge Hill, who will be chairing this afternoon's session. Over to you, Elke.
Thank you, Jo. You've kindly already introduced Kristen, so I'm just going to hand over directly to Kristen so she can start her presentation. We've got about 45 minutes of presentation and then questions at the end. And as I said, it's probably easiest if you use the hand raising button, which is basically that little thing within the emoticon at the top, in the top row, or you can use the chat.
Okay, good evening, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's so good to be here with you for this lovely conference that I too agree is a fantastic idea of giving us time to digest what we learn as opposed to having to take it in all at the same time. So this is a fantastic idea. I want to thank the organizers, Elke, so much for inviting me and giving me this little time to share some ideas, some thoughts that I have with you. And so I come from the Black Baptist tradition in America. And one of the things that we often say is in a sermon is, particularly if you have some real quick points that you want to make because you really want to get to the benediction, or in our case, the Q&A, we say, I'm not going to be with you long. And so this is very much in that spirit and in that vein. So today I want to talk through some of the big points that I've been working on and researching on and eventually continuing on in another book project. I call this talk, let me see if I can find it. If you know, you know. Televisual representations, resonances, and the near impossibility of doing it right. And so one of the things that I think about is how headlines abound about diversity and inclusion. Every week, my social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook are inundated with imagery and headlines that just happen to circulate around the question of progress and diversity in Hollywood. Within the last 7 days, for example, in addition to learning that Britney Spears now has access to her Instagram unfettered by her managers, Free Britney, hashtag, there are also consistent posts about the success women and men and women of color lead and how they lead in the box office and behind the scenes in film and in television. So you can see here, I start here in 2018, and then we can sort of continue through, I just did like a quick scroll through headlines today just to give a sense of all of the different stories that emerge around this question of diversity, inclusion, and television. Now, part of the rationale for talking about how people talk about these images and these headlines is based in our popular understanding of representation. Contemporarily, representation means seeing a similar self in a mediated fashion, be it television, film, online, magazine covers, graphic novels, etc. Where the popular and the academic overlap is in the constant conversation around representation. The notion of racial representation in film and television is one that scholars from a variety of fields and disciplines have addressed with fervor. And of course, it makes sense that they would. The statistical data that comes from studies seeking to quantify how much difference has made its way to the entertainment industry suggests that understanding the limits of representation is a crucial area for further research. And so you can see here all of these charts, all of this data that has been done through the Writers Guild of America, through the Directors Guild, and through early charts of SAG-AFTRA. And I'll talk about this just really quickly. So I have here the graphs from the diversity reports that were produced for each of the guilds that illustrate the dearth of diversity with regard to white women and men and women of color. And so you can see here the status of Writers Guild members from 2007 to 2014 and 2010 to 2014. You can see here that the most recent data is that women accounted for 44% of the 2,700 TV writing jobs, while 35% of the writing jobs went to people of color, which the way that it's written, it always feels like they're talking about Black and brown men, because where are Black and brown women in this number? A look at hiring over the last 10 years reveals a trend of steady gains made by women and people of color. The report found in each of the last 4 TV seasons, both groups increased their share of TV writing jobs, gaining 2% in the 2017-2018 season, 3% in the 2018-2019 season, and 5% in the 2019-2020 season. Of course, while these seem steady gains within the world of the Writers Guild, they certainly seem paltry in comparison. I also have here the Directors Guild Directors Guild Diversity Report from 2021 over on the left side here, and you can see that what I think they may have done 3,000 or 4,000 episodes looked at, and based in who directed them, they were able to sort of break apart this chart. And so here you can see in 2021, their chart is 67% of all television episodes were directed by white folks, while 18% were directed by African American, 7% by Latinx folks, 6% Asian American, and 2% other unknown, unreported. And that number is always really interesting because that number is largely based in people who do not choose to check a box on the survey, because in their minds, in the same sort of logic with acting categories, there's something about being known for a racial identity that makes some individuals feel that they cannot, that they won't be able to progress. And you can see in comparison, of course, there is some gain. 69% in 2014 were Caucasian male, 67%. So there's that whole 2% decrease. And of course, the fun part about this chart is that Black men are overrepresented in this right-hand corner, 22% male directors of color. Black men are overrepresented by one person. One Black man has directed the majority of the episodes that constitute that 22% number. And of course, that would be Tyler Perry. So it is not necessary. So it is important that we look at these gains. It's important that we look at these numbers because these numbers inform how we make sense of things. Lastly, I would draw your attention to this little small chart here. This is from SAG before it became SAG-AFTRA. The last time that they produced a chart was in 2008, 2009. So this is the last one. And this is a problematic chart on a number of ways because this is both informed by anonymous surveys of the membership and who elected to self-identify themselves, but it is also in part informed by by Screen Actors Guild's employees and diversity reps who would go to different studios or go to different sets and eyeball count the diversity. So you can see in many ways why they have not produced another chart. Not only that, it helps to put faces to the statistics through these sublime examples of Black folks making it into the top 1% of content creators and developers. And so, in the last 2 to 3 years, there have been so many stories and headlines about Black women, Black folks in general who have hit that brass ring and have gotten these ginormous development deals. You have Shonda, who left ABC for for Netflix, and and then had her success with Bridgerton, and then I think last week it was reported that she has now expanded it to a $300 million deal. Natasha Rothwell, who was a supporting actor in Insecure, has a development deal with ABC Signature. Issa Rae is sticking beside HBO Max with her development deal. Channing Dungey, who was at ABC, who was the president of ABC, left ABC in 2018 at the same time that Shonda left, at the same time that Kenya Barris left to go to Netflix. And then Mara Brock-Akil inked a Netflix deal last year. And of course, Kenya Barris leaves ABC to go to Netflix. So all of these things are important. But wait, these Wonderland deals aren't always what they seem. If the news about Barris and Dungey leaving Netflix is any indicator, right? That if it is a question of us having made it, right, and this goal of representation and diversity and inclusion, these ideas finally taking hold within the industry, then why are these big named deals, these two at least significantly big name personalities and creators or executives leaving the studio that is actually at this point very much one of those off the cliff places where you can't really make more money than what you're making unless you do what Barris did and get a board seat at Viacom through BET Studios, like the moves that have to be made in order to sort of justify leaving the space of the tech/film studio Netflix become something that we need to sort of think about. So one thing that these situations can tell us, and one thing that I want to sort of dig into, as often as this data is revealed and then broken away with in these instances, with relatively little change year after year, one has to wonder if the question to answer is more related to how the media industries attempt to remedy this gross lack of representation, right? And some of the ways that they do it is by cherry picking the best of the best, the makers who have the most name recognition and putting them in positions of high, putting them in these development deals and these multi-year deals and giving them some measure of power. That I think is a thing, right, to take notice of. I think zooming in on one specific type of representation, Black representation, allows for a consideration of a set of remedies that attempt continually to address this imbalance. Okay, so Black representation, as it's been understood in the popular sense, has been dominated by the circulation of mediated imagery, yielding these deleterious effects for the groups depicted. Because of the fear of the effects of such poor representation, what has resulted is a set of binary, non-scientific, underdeveloped metrics, positive and negative, we might call them, that constitute this nebulous catch-all system wherein the characteristics that define each pole on the spectrum shift depending on the era and the expectations of the audience. And so what marks a representation as positive or negative? Responses are often aligned with class, that being a good job, that being education, community-minded, thoughtful folks like Vivica Fox in a suit on her way to her job as an accountant, where you never actually see her accounting for anything. Behavior, in terms of being hypersexual or hyper woke or well-spoken or just woke. Or with characterizations of character that either successfully assimilate into normative culture or fail to do so. However, such a scale oversimplifies the complexities of Black identity that require audiences, pop culture critics, and scholars to invest in screen characters through experiencing nuances developed over time, and ironically, that reinforce those stereotypes that operate as industry shorthand. Moreover, this strategy, this positive versus negative strategy, that attempts to overlap negative images with positive ones in a quest to present a respectability of social imagery, sadly cannot eradicate either. So if then stereotypes function as this kind of shorthand for building characters, and if the only additive needed to make the parts positive is to provide them a respectable occupation, again, I'm looking at Vivica Fox here in these movies in the 90s and the 2000s, where she pretty much wore a suit and went in elevators and drove a little Mercedes, had, her nice relaxer, and the same with Gabrielle Union here from Deliver Us from Eva. Like, there was this moment where to be positive, to be a good Black woman, was to wear a suit, right? Then whatever other problematic traits that were initially associated with that stereotype can pass scrutiny unchecked. The result of such a calculus is the production of thinly written characters of color with a mirage of depth added by audience members and pop culture critics who labor to thicken the characteristics and characterizations in the public discourse. This discourse, for example, surrounding the importance to film and television history, gives these wavering characterizations a steady platform to lean against and be perceived as solid and weighty. Now, such a style of writing by stereotype reversal also cannot include the kinds of complex characterization that would offset colorblind casting. That is the That is the casting process of not writing race into roles that actors audition for. Now, what this often results in is an unfortunate set of pitfalls that reinforce long-held tropes about the bodies that the blind casting worked so hard to neutralize. The work that I've done featuring most of Shonda Rhimes' ABC series epitomizes this approach for all of its advantages and ultimately its repercussions. And so you can see here the Entertainment Weekly cover with all of her TGIT leading ladies. You have Ellen Pompeo, you have Viola Davis, you have Kerry Washington from Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder and Grey's Anatomy in reverse order there, and how the ways that she thought about these characters, that while Olivia Pope is based on an actual Black woman in the real world, how she matched the phenotype of that character, the character, to the real person. The spirit of their characterization was very much through the spirit of colorblindness, as I would say it. And of course, Viola Davis's Annalise Keating was originally written for a white woman that then Viola Davis was able to, because she had the leverage and the agency to do so in ways that other Black women would not have, was able to reverse engineer a Black woman out of that normatively white written woman. And then of course there's Ellen Pompeo, who was, the OG and the one who the network, once her role was set and once her character as white Meredith Grey was cast, everything else in terms of casting was developed around her whiteness, right? So we can have different bodies. We can do this blind casting thing where we pick the so-called best person for the part, but whoever she's matched with has to look like her. Okay. And you can continue and extend this conversation into Bridgerton. I confess I have not watched Bridgerton. I will not be watching Bridgerton, but from what I've seen, not a whole lot has changed. So as I prepared for this conversation, I returned to my book on this topic and thought that this point that I made was prescient. I said that it's stunning how these same industrial practices that are mentioned throughout this book, this is in the conclusion, are consistently being deployed in the service of so-called progress. And again, while the networks and producers sometimes get it right, for me, it seems to be more akin to a watch telling the right time twice a day. The watch is broken, but points in a fashion that will ultimately be accurate for a short amount of time. While the increase in minority leads is certainly a vast improvement from seasons past, while the increase in minorities in positions of power, to add to that, is certainly a vast improvement from years past. I cannot stress enough how much of what is being ordered for networks involves mere skin representation. And of course, the matter of blind casting is still hailed as the best equal opportunity innovation within the casting world. So eliminating these pitfalls of colorblind representation can only occur when writers have enough presence of mind to realize that tethered to racialized bodies are histories that make their representation more complex and require forethought before assuming characterization and storyline affect everyone the same. Now, the fight between these representational strategies is always at a stalemate, leading to this third strategy with a simplified mantra that I call representation matters. If this maxim appears to extract the value-charged attributes of positive and negative representation in favor of appreciating all characterizations more equally, upon closer inspection, it actually integrates those positive, negative binaries into this new grid of characterizations. Representation mattering then becomes this dual and dueling set of expectations for people of color. In the first instance, every image deemed valuable must be accessible for identificatory suture. Everything that you see, you must be able to say, I see myself by visual alone. In the second instance, each image must be counted as a signifier of progress that affirms Black importance and success. That is proof that, yes, we have made it. That the number of tweets I saw celebrating Shonda Rhimes' $300 million deal with Netflix, as if that is going to point toward her actually hiring Black folks to write series for her, which she has not done. We still celebrate it as this marker of success, this marker of progress, this marker that we have made it, when we haven't made it anywhere, just her. However, in this moment, when consumers of Black media proudly state that representation matters, they disavow the universalist texts, disavowing the possibility of disavowing universalist texts like Bridgerton or like, Bridgerton, may be impossible because there are so few other alternatives. And this returns me to thinking about the approach to representation matters. So this catchphrase circulating in conversations around diversity has gained traction from these social media campaigns, such as #representation matters, in which parents attach the hashtag to inspirational photos taken of their children dressed as fictional and non-fictional Black heroic characters, posing them against their on-screen doppelgangers, and the copious infographics that state facts about the importance of on-screen representation to marginalized characters. I'm also thinking about, there was recently an Olympics ad that has all these young children, these young girls, these young Black and brown girls looking at the screen and watching, Black and brown gymnasts do or Black and brown athletes do these jobs and matching and connecting with them. And so you can very much see how this idea of representation matters has permeated into from just the audience having a response to it being something more significant, or something ingrained into the fabric. Oops. Okay, so So to Mattel's offering of a collector Barbie of Ava DuVernay, complete with the mise-en-scène of a director's chair to establish that all little Black girls need to see DuVernay's image in tandem with a chair to believe that they could too work in film. Thinking this way produces a set of unintended consequences. The first is that any representation that includes a person of color is automatically and becomes an automatic sign of success and progress, as I mentioned. And second, that these automatic signs that actually function as paltry gains trigger easy workarounds for the executive suites, whereby hiring racially diverse actors and placing them on magazine covers or placing them in these contexts becomes this easy substitute for developing new complex characters and thinking through the complexity of hiring both in front of and behind the camera. The results of this choice, I often talk about, feel plastic and are very much in that vein of what plastic is. And so, you know, as I've said, let me be clear, while I do not share the popular expectation for mediated imagery to matter, I think, which I will get to in just a second, it's overdetermining of Black images as the marker of societal progress or regression makes any image acceptable on its face, obliterating the context and sidelining any consideration of depth. Thus, have images in the era of representation matters become these hollow, malleable signs with artificial or no, in fact, origin. Their artificiality connects to this condition that could be termed plastic representation, in the sense of this synthetic material that can be molded into these different shapes, and supplies this useful starting point for unpacking just how plastic representation operates as this place of synthetic malleability. So based on what I've outlined here, I think we can call together this working definition of plastic representation. And I would say that as a definition, it is the combination of synthetic elements put together and shaped to look like meaningful imagery, but which can only approximate depth and substance because ultimately it is hollow and cannot survive close scrutiny. So this is why I think I named this presentation "If You Know, You Know," because plastic is dangerous when it is confused with organic, more meaningful diversity. Plastic representation uses the wonder that comes from seeing characters on screen who serve as visual identifiers for specific demographics in order to suffocate the expectation to desire anything more. In this instance, then, progress is merely the increase of Black actors on screen, or merely the sprinkling of Black creatives positioned in particular places across the studio and film industries as significant, right? The problem with such a line of thinking is that quantifiable difference alone often overdetermines the benchmarks of progress and obscures the multifaceted challenges inherent in booking roles, as well as securing work on writing staffs, directing gigs, or even reaching executive gatekeeper status, thus privileging the visible actors over all other cinematic and televisual functions. Employment, while a critical factor in the lives of minority creative laborers, becomes the only gain when plastic representation is the fail-safe. Of course, skill sets and work experience matter and are part of what is considered for these jobs in writing, directing, and executive suites. However, the cultural and labor force should be as equally important a contribution to how the work is produced. While visual diversity is still not a regular occurrence, in my opinion, it's not impossible to achieve. It is always impressive to me to see the greater numbers of people of color are finding employment in inclusive spaces within the film and television industry. But greater numbers indicate not necessarily progress, but rather a simplistic fix to a systemic problem. For this industry, actual progress would involve crafting a more weighted diversity, one generated by adding dimension and specificity to roles and achieved in tandem with diverse bodies shaping those roles at the level of producing and writing. So here's where we go. We're here now. And at the end of this moment where I've come to with plastic representation, the thought came to me, we're not going anywhere else. It's very hard to do this, right? It is nearly impossible to get to complex characterization of people, of men and women of color. It is very, very difficult to do for a number of reasons. And so this began this process of trying to figure out where or how these things can be done. What examples do I have? And mostly it exists in shadow form, or mostly it exists in thinking about feelings. And that's where I want to take us and end us with, is that while the idea of plastic representation is tying audiences, and particularly Black and brown audiences, to the visual version of themselves on screen, I think that there's probably something about that that makes sense, but there's actually a piece that's missing, and that is not just the visual that connects us, or that it is overly reductive to make it just the visual that connects us, but it should be the visual in tandem with the sound, in tandem with the characterization, the way that they talk, the way that they exist, the music that you hear as they move through their spaces. That something about that is meaningful, and something about that in an environment where we have so few resources and so few really well-built characters. How do you carve out a schemata for what is possible? And so this is where I come to this question of sonic visibility. And just as an example, I want to posit 2 quick clips together to show you what I mean. So this idea of sonic visibility is the idea that it is not just, again, the visual of the bodies on screen that connect you as a viewer to what you're seeing, but that it is the experience, the context around it. It is the sound, it is what you hear, it is all those things that then tether you, that speak and hail you as a viewer to what you're seeing on screen, and that is what creates the kind of representation that is meaningful. And so I have here 2 clips. One is from a scene in Beloved, and one is from a scene in Lovecraft Country. And both of these, I think, have a very similar tactic. Both of them are embracing the same sort of thing, that is exorcism of evil spirits. But for me, one of them feels more resonant than the other. And I want to sort of spin on that for a minute and chew on that for a minute. So if you have not seen Beloved, quickly, Beloved is, the spirit of the daughter that Setha had to kill in order to escape remaining enslaved, and this spirit has driven her crazy, and the church, the Black church women have come to help. And so I'm going to speed through some of this clip just to get to the part where it starts to connect. Amen. So I'm just going to skip past a little bit. So that's that version. Here's the version from Lovecraft Country where they are exercising a white supremacist spirit from the basement of their haunted house.
Mama Oya, I, a dutiful servant, call upon you to use me as a vessel. So together we may cleanse the space of these tormented spirits. Move l'esprit, nous pas jamais exister dans le monde sans corps. Disparaît tout en quatre cadino.
Skip.
Nous pas jamais exister dans le monde sans corps.
Now, there's more that goes on with this. And in another clip, the next clip, and actually maybe the closer clip, they play a Shirley Caesar song, right? A gospel artist who is played in concert with the actual exorcism. And you see the bodies of Emmett Till and other, slain Black young men at this time who are freed because the white supremacist spirit has left. Now, what's interesting to me about this sequence, about these two pieces, is that for me, the Beloved sequence is much more resonant for me. There's something about these Black women, the bodies of these Black women, the faces of these Black women, the moans and the groans of these Black women singing this song. There's something about that feels much more resonant. There's something about that feels much more tied to something in the real that I recognize and that is familiar to me. The sequence on the right in Lovecraft is much more horror oriented, much more familiar in that capacity. And even with the Shirley Caesar sync, it still feels plastic to me. It feels that it is drawing on a recognition of something, or a recognition of something that we can meme or think about more than something that connects. And I think that is, for me, the distinction between these two things. So with regard to this, and as I leave you, I have a number of clips, and just based in time, I'm only going to pick two before I close, that I think also speak to this question of resonating. What can we do if there's this dearth, if there's not enough, and if plastic representation and through the lens of colorblind casting is where we are headed, and it seems to be the case. So what do we do? I have a clip from The Good Fight from season 3. The one where a Nazi is punched, that I think illuminates on what the possibilities are, that speak to how you can include an ensemble of Black voices in this way that is dimensional without attention to just one person, that allows the conversation to flow. So I'll just let this play.
Happy now? Are you talking to me? You didn't like Maya? You could have just come out and said that. This isn't about disliking her. We've all been told that there is a zero tolerance policy on drugs. Maya, however, use drugs. She's been arrested twice. But because she's white, oh my God, family don't know how to raise. In this case, it absolutely is. You found her since she first got here. I don't care, but if it's one of us, I want to advise. Me. I think it's thrown out of here because of a zero tolerance policy. That's exactly what it is. This isn't something that's just going to fade away. The associates are angry.
Yes.
Okay, so just a quick little snippet of that continues, and that is one of the things that makes The Good Fight such a really fascinating and rich show for diversity and inclusion because of the ways that it commingles whatever the story of the day is with these bodies of color who are talking on their own, right? Like each person has a perspective, and no perspective is monolithic and no perspective is the same, but there's something about it that connects, something about the way that they talk and think that feels resonant, that feels familiar, that tethers you as the viewer to it. The last one I will show for time's sake is this PSA that was done around the election, and you can see it for yourself.
Get your booty to the pole, 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 get your booty to the pole. Yeah.
Did we get your attention? Good. So, you're really not gonna vote? You know it's more than just the president on the ballot, right? Check it. A district attorney decides who to prosecute, including whether or not to go after the dirty cops. Do you know who elects the DA? We do, but you don't want to vote. Can't make it rain if you locked up on some bullshit. Want trades and coding taught in our schools? Then vote for the school boards that will prepare us for the job market. Want to end cash bail? Well, then vote for the sheriffs and county officials that feel the same way you do. But you talking about, oh, they gonna pick who they gonna pick, shouty. Ferguson just elected their first black mayor. You know how that happened? It's clear Black lives don't matter to some of our current elected officials. If they matter to you, then don't let other people decide who's gonna run your community. Get your booty to the poll. Get your booty to the poll. Get your booty to the poll.
Get your vote. Stretch.
For information on how and where to vote, as well as resources to find out who's running where you live, go to getyourbootytothepoll.com.
Okay. So yes, in fact, get your booty to the poll. And I think there's something about
show you around, see what we do.
Sorry. There's something about the way that Get Your Booty to the Poll operates and functions on the level of resonance, right? It knows who its viewer is. It knows who it is trying to target. And it is very clear from the very first shot of the ass in close-up moving farther away from us about how it is targeting and how it is trying to connect, both visually, but also sonically, also in terms of the conversation and the ways that these women are know who their clientele is. So the last thing I will say,
Happy now? You didn't like Maya, you could have just come out and said that. This isn't about disliking.
Sorry. The final thought I have here is about possibilities. And again, these examples that I've just shown, just these quick ones, and in the Q&A we can talk more, but it is very hard, damn near impossible, to be able to do sonic visibility, to do meaningful, complex characterization, and to have have a thoughtful narrative all in one. It's very difficult in Hollywood for all those things to come together. But one of the few times that I did notice that it did happen was in the limited series of HBO's Watchmen from 2019. And one of the reasons why it happened, and that I often talk about in my book, is because, as I say, sometimes it takes a white man. And in that case, it was the white man named Damon Lindelof who the HBO wanted to work with and was willing to give time to create, to build a story, to develop a story, time to hire a diverse body of writers for his writer's room, to hire not just the folks who he knew, but a lot of folks who he didn't, to the time and the resources to put those folks in a room, to give them these books to read, for them to be able to argue about what these things, these concepts and these ideas that he wants to break throughout the course of this series, all of that to make that happen. That requires time and resources that many folks are given within the media and the television and film industries. And when they are, right, in the case of LaShonda, right, she goes to things that are interesting to her, but not necessarily for the good of all Black mankind, right? So there are differences in this. And the product, the end game of Watchmen, where you have this scene, and if you've not seen it, the statute of limitations have run out. Okay, y'all, we gonna live. Y'all will live. We can deal with it. But to have an end scene of this nature, right, where the Black woman potentially becomes the superhero in the way that it happens, in this origin story that is dense and dimensional and historical and connects to, you know, epigenetics and you know, the Tulsa riots and all of these things. Like, so interesting how it all interconnects. It requires a lot of time and thought, things that Hollywood doesn't have. So just as we're thinking about what the possibilities are, this would be my offering. And so we'll just watch this, and with this, I close.
Wash the eggs.
So that's the thing you can do. Give someone your powers?
I suppose I could transfer my atomic components into some sort of organic material. If someone were to consume it, they would inherit, as you call them, my powers.
So you could put them in this egg, and if I ate it, I could walk on water?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay, so with that, I return back to the close, which is effectively, what is it? What are the possibilities? And if that is what you just saw, the possibility, and if we take into account all the myriad ways that to get to that requires so that like a concerted effort of epic proportions. How do you create that more often? And if you can't, then what? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen, sorry. What a fascinating paper. I took loads and loads of notes and I have thousands of questions, but let me maybe ask one, which was precisely about that. You know, the difference you wanted to highlight between Beloved and Lovecraft Country, where you felt that with Beloved there was something very much more resonant for you. I was wondering if with Lovecraft country, if that was also to do precisely with the question of genre, which you highlighted to some extent, you know, the kind of the tropes of horror and how horror sometimes has a tendency to use cultural elements, cultural tropes very stereotypically, you know, not just in relation to, for example, Black culture, but also indigenous culture, etc. So is this something to do with genre, basically, is my question.
In some ways, yeah. I think that, I mean, it's interesting because Beloved is both melodrama, but also has this horror, this thread of horror embedded within it, and so I think that you can that in some ways it felt like I think I prefer. I mean, I clearly preferred the way that Beloved sort of went about the process of using the horror, the very sort of visible connections and conventions of horror, but also sort of fused it with this melodramatic moment, this moment of high Black church. And what I think also is interesting is that, you know, I don't think Jonathan Demme ever went to a Black church. I don't think he ever had any idea about what Black women do, or like the call and you know, the call response method by which we go and do these proceedings. But there was something that felt organic about the materials of that scene. Whereas with Lovecraft Country, it is turning on the conventions of the horror genre. And it is, of course, fusing it with these culturally specific moments, you know, the Shirley Caesar soundtrack, which I picked the wrong clip, and also sort of the bodies and the sort of the references, like the Emmett Till reference and all these things. But there is something about that feels like that is the gift in and of itself. Like that's it. Like there isn't anything more than that. And that is and I think that's where the plasticity sort of comes out for me, is that it feels like it is its own reference point. It is its own signifier. It is its own sort of like, look at what we brought out. Aren't we so smart? And it doesn't do any more deep work than that. So it feels celebratory in that it recognizes what it is, and that feels less organic than the materials in Beloved.
Great, thank you. So I'm opening up questions to the rest of the participants. Maybe you want to raise your hand, that would help. Or use the chat. Oh, David, you have a question. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I would like to, with my question, I would like to tap into this question of diversification, and I'm still sort of thinking how to ask the question as I speak, because my position is that of a white Central European male. So obviously, I only have so much experience, first-hand experience with diversification, both in my teaching experience and with television research. But my talk during the conference is going to be about the expense, a much kind of disputed science fiction television series, which started out on Sci-Fi and then was taken over by Amazon, which itself is kind of material for a lot of discussions. So the question is this: do you think that it would be too kind of bold to suggest that certain genres and certain kind of niche formats are in some ways more conducive to the kind of diversification that that is not just a manifestation of, so to speak, tokenism. And the reason why I'm asking this is because the expense, I don't know how many of those who are in the audience are familiar with the expense, but the television show was actually praised and commended quite a lot in the publicity that it received, precisely for the job that it did in regards to diversification. So I'm thinking about actors and actresses like Frankie Adams in the role of Bobby Draper, a Martian Marine, or Shura Agdarslu in the role of Christian Avasarala, or Cass Anwar. I mean, in spite of the scandal that he was involved in when season 4 wrapped, including accusations of sexual assault and so on and so forth. But you could also mention Kara G in the role of drummer. So the show really did go at length in sort of not simply showcasing actors and actresses of color, but also in terms of sort of putting them into roles where their ethnic background does make sense, also from the point of view of the narrative, from the point of view of the character arcs of those characters that they embody, that they play. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I think I'm only tangentially familiar with Expanse. I know people talk a lot about it and talk very highly of it, and so and in particular with regard to the ways that it and the way that it uses its characters, actors of color. And so, if at the end of the day, the characters are allowed, that it is not that the characters happen to be Black or brown, but that their racialized bodies and the experiences that come with those bodies are part of the narrative. It's not to say that they walk around with a sandwich board saying like, I'm black, or I'm brown, but it's how do the experiences that they bring to the story, are those experiences thought about as they are being used in the narrative? And that, I think, is the difference between really thoughtful specificity and really thoughtful use of and recognition of bodies, and recognition that we need that of writers in the writers' room who are thinking about those bodies, versus the more standard, we got Black people, we should just put them in there and let's just see what happens kind of thought.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And also, I think that it again, this sort of characterization ties in to some extent with the sonic visibility. Obviously, within the realm of science fiction, within the realm of speculative fiction, when it comes to world building, this is a slightly different question. But I think that one of the other things that was really appreciated in relation to the show was the sonic visibility. So characters who are identified as belters, so people living in and beyond the asteroid belt, and obviously are displaced identities and kind of disenfranchised identities. The way they talk, the kind of belter Creole that they would be speaking, I think also comes close to what you described as sonic visibility. Although I would need to look into that in more details, because this kind of parallelism just occurred to me as I was listening to your talk. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Mareike, you have your hand up, so I just hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, Kristen, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I was actually kind of wondering about, like, generally just been thinking recently more about cultural hierarchies and the cultural hierarchies that dominate television. And I was just kind of very, very struck. Like, I mean, you picked really, really good examples, but at the same time, obviously, Watchmen is an HBO show. So is Lovecraft Country. So I just kept wondering in terms of like, who is this for? Like, who's this representation for that is kind of like linked to issues of accessibility just because of how expensive they are and things like that?
No, I think that's a good question. And I think part of with particularly with HBO and Lovecraft Country, as well as Watchmen, I think, the shows that feature Black leads, and you can include I May Destroy You in that, Insecure in that, these shows have to sort of do what I call bifocal demographics work, where they may very well be explicitly targeting a Black audience or trying to target Black audience with the characterization and the narrative. But then there are but they also have to acknowledge that white audiences may or may not choose to stay if they feel like they aren't allowed in, or if they feel like they have to work to learn what's happening. And so the bifocal sort of approach is generalizable enough to be able to be what people call universal, and be able to sort of connect widely, and also have that other thing happening. And so it's a tightrope. Lovecraft, I think, is in its way trying to minimize the generalizability, but only but because of the horror conventions, and because it is, based in the novel, and because, of H.P. Lovecraft and all that stuff, I think we all kind of understand what this is, but it has just been made specific for these Black actors to be able to figure out what to do. So I think it's a really good question of who is this for and who are they thinking about. I think if you are a Black creator, you have to think about multiple audiences all at the same time in ways that perhaps white creators don't. And so I'm really interested in, how Damon Lindelof is thinking in this, is attempting to try and think in this bifurcated manner as well, but in the reverse, and in how he needs, and in order to do this, all the support, all of the Black writers to be able to help him figure out how to make that manifest.
Thank you.
Great. We've just had a question from Deepali. Deepali, I believe your microphone isn't working, or is basically being used by someone else at the moment, so I'm going to be so bold as to just read it out. Do you find it sometimes difficult to critique programs and films where the cast are predominantly Black or Asian, as we are expected to appreciate some representation is better than none? For example, during recent discussions about Lovers Rock by Steve McQueen, generally no one would hear a word against it.
It absolutely is difficult, in part because of exactly what you said, right? Like, there is this dearth, and so we should just be so grateful when we have work that features us in some capacity. So if it's, giving the mic to Steve McQueen to do this series, and, how beautiful it is, and, how specific it is to a particular moment, like, all of those things are there. And yes, because it is so well done aesthetically and stylistically, it becomes really hard to be able to talk about it narratively. That the episode, the dance hall episode, for example, I did not connect to it. It did not resonate with me, but that is because my background is different. And so it didn't hit me like it hit everyone else. It wasn't as sexual. It was sexual, and it was lovely, and it was sweet, but it didn't do for me what it did for others. And so it was one of those things where that is, I think, like, that was fun and fine to be able to debate. But yes, if it gets to the, like, is the, who is this for, that question, I think that is a hard question to answer. That is a hard question to ask, because I think that would spirit all these other conversations. probably a more easy example would be Shonda's Bridgerton, and how everybody, like it seemed like we all lost. Again, I hadn't seen the show, but we all kind of lost our minds over the black lead, the black male lead, and didn't sort of take stock into sort of the ways that his blind cast character and the blind cast black woman, for example, while certainly what happened for them in the terms of the story certainly wasn't predicated upon them being black bodies, but because we have that mediation, because we have those histories, it certainly feels like they fell into tropes. And we couldn't really talk about that because everybody just wanted to talk about how pretty that black man was, and that was just it. And the black people in the regions here, and so you couldn't actually critique. Okay, yeah, it's good that there are black people, and I don't have any doubt that there were black people who existed in that time. But can we think about where these black people come from? Can we think about the histories that dictate how they got there, rather than sort of just lean into the suspension of disbelief that that's how they got, that they've always been there? You couldn't have that conversation, and that I think speaks to the ways that we sort of grasp on maybe to the wrong things rather than asking the harder questions.
Great, thank you. Michael, you've got your hand up, so over to you.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you very much for that. I'm really fascinated by the sort of pedagogical possibilities of your ideas, and my students often applaud sort of surface representation, but they seldom think about the sort of depth of that representation on screen. And I was just wondering if you have any advice on how we might sort of apply some of these ideas as a sort of a methodology for teaching, but also understanding depth and race representation on screen. Now, I mean, this question is kind of paired with a little bit of my experience, and very briefly, in particular, I'm approaching this question as sort of white Welsh man, and when workshopping ideas of Wales and Welshness on TV, I often default to theories of othering, thinking about Wales and Welshness in the context of Englishness on screen. With feminism, we teach using, we start that conversation using something like the Bechdel test. And I was wondering, if you could just expand on how we might begin to have these conversations about depth with sort of race representation on screen. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think part of the answer is in really getting students to ground themselves in I always, in my classes, we always sort of walk through Stuart Hall's idea of the regime of racial representation, where he talks about how despite, all of the good representations that there may be, that there is this warehouse of problematic, so-called negative representations, that stereotypes that exist. And no matter how many good ones we might produce, the bad ones are still there, right? We don't vanquish them. And so they circulate and they circulate and they circulate and they haunt us. And so if you can ground them in that, be it in thinking about race or thinking about nationality or thinking about ethnicity or what have you, and sort of get them to sort of think about, okay, what are like the fundamental circuits of representation that are around these types of bodies? Then how do you thinking about, okay, well, so if we can't get rid of them, then what do we do? How do we move through that? How do we transcode? And so like thinking through the different methods of that, the different approaches of that. Do we just avoid it at all times? We're just good. We just Vivica Fox it, or do we, do we colorblind cast it? But maybe we colorblind cast it thinking, with the agency that Viola Davis gives us. So maybe we reverse engineer some difference into the character. Or, can we think about, or in the case of Watchmen, for example, one of the most brilliant uses of colorblind casting is in the strategic use of Dr. Manhattan, right? Taking Manhattan, as this white man and transferring him into this, spoilers, black man's body, right? All of these things, and sort of bringing him out on the other side. Explains why the character felt so odd at the beginning. I was like, he feels blind cast. I don't know why, but he feels blind cast. There's something about this that feels off, and that there being a reason for that. Like, there's something about walking them through an approach of that sort, and sort of walking them through sort of the dimensionality of it, how colorblind casting is exploited for that might get them to think about what they miss every day, when they're watching shows, what they don't see every day, like the simplicity of shorthand every day, and how if you notice what something is missing, in this instance, it's filled in. It's explained why that thing is missing, why that character doesn't have the specificity that you would expect a character like Cal to have. And there is something about that I think helps them. So it's first grounding them in the recognition that we are never able to relieve ourselves of these mediated types, and then to be able to sort of move them into thinking about what approaches we can do to work within those, to see them, to recognize them, and then to sort of work through them and those processes. And so I think once you get there, they can get really good at recognizing them and being able to go, oh, I saw that character is blind cast, and that just feels weird. And they're able to sort of recognize it. And that, I think, is, for me, the win.
That's incredibly valuable. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Sorry, but any further questions? I just realized I'm muted. Any further questions? If not, I'm going to ask another question. I did see someone's hand go up quickly there, but then disappear again. Oh yeah, Claire.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, marvelous. Thank you, Kristen. This is amazing. It's lovely hearing you talking about this. Can I take you back to Watchmen for a moment?
Please, let's go.
Do you think the alternate reality allowed them to deal with truth and fantasy in an innovative way that gave us the expression of blackness that was very unique?
Potentially. I mean, I think that the question, for me, and I've talked about this in other places, Watchmen operates as really expensive fan fiction, where Lindelof is so super familiar with the graphic novel and the source material, and then sort of is able to see the holes that have been left, and is able to sort of use those, like, Swiss cheese holes to then sort of pull through that, like, this narrative, through that these characters, and through that these origin stories that should exist, but that exist in that world, but we don't have access to in its initial iterations. And so I think it is, there was a point earlier made about the science fiction genre as being a space where there is more flexibility. And I would say that is probably applicable here, but to sort of wrap it, in the veil of real happenings, right? To sort of set it for Lindelof to say, I really am interested in, Black Wall Street, and I'm really interested in what happened in 1922, and I'm really interested in 21, and seeing, how that can create this origin story for a superhero that we don't see, and to give it legibility in the Black experience. There's something about that feels more than what, a Black Captain America can be. Or which I dread, or a Black Batman. I dread that, because there is no way that origin story will match, and it will trope, and it will be very, very painful to watch. This is original materials and organic materials, at least. And I think that there's something about taking that and mixing that with the with the original IP that really just sort of sends it off. But I also understand that that is not something that you can reproduce easily. And so I'm grateful to him for not trying to do a season 2 for money.
Yes, I agree, even though I'd love to know. But did you think Sister Night was a superhero even before the egg?
I mean,
I did.
I mean, I never really paid attention to the key art and noticed that she was blue. I just never did. And now it's just like, oh, she was all the time. Like, yes, I think she was. I think that the story, if she took the egg or not, she is a superhero. But I think the added bonus, the added sort of like elegance of this supernatural reality, I think speaks to something that it's just super fascinating to me. And again, to contrast that with Lovecraft, the episode where the Black woman is sort of like in time incarnate and superhero and in this Afrofuturistic thing, I think that is the gain in and of itself, right? You see the possibilities, let's celebrate them. That's so great, isn't it so great? This feels, again, to me, and maybe because I like a little nuance, I like a little let us think about it. I like a little ambiguity. There's something about this ending where is she going to step on the water? Is she going to walk on the water? That is left to us to decide. That is left to us to decide how her power manifests. About that feels a bit more, again, organic and feels more resonant.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Claire says thank you. I might ask my question now, which is about genre again, but here about, we've talked today about primarily high-end or quality drama. Sure. What about the other genres? Is there more space in other genres to develop that kind of nuance? The reason I'm asking this is because I'm reading a book at the moment which talks about the representation of disability in Little Women. Oh God, what is it called?
Oh, the reality show? Yes.
Yeah, reality show, exactly. So how might there be better spaces to develop character, as at the end of the day, these are performances as well. So how might other genres offer better opportunities?
I mean, I think the interesting thing is that reality television has long figured it out. It's just that the ways that the characters resonate don't generate positive, and I use that very like in scare quotes, positive affect in audiences. So in other words, if you're watching Real Housewives of Atlanta, or if you're watching Basketball Wives and the women fight each other, but the reason why they're fighting makes sense. The fight is the thing that you have to disavow and disengage and say, oh, this is not how Black women should behave. We are setting ourselves back, right? Like our respectability politics get in the way of us being able to see the complexity and characterization of these performers having this conversation or having this debate or having this fight. And so I think we do. And so I think the reality shows have been at it. The reality shows have been at variations of complex characterization, or when we allow it as audiences, us to be able to not just celebrate seeing ourselves on screen, but debate what we see. So the comment earlier about being able to critique, that is the space where we are able to do, the critique. We are able to, chastise and discipline and empathize and sympathize, and vicariously live through these characters who make these choices that we wouldn't make in our day-to-day lives. And so I think they get it, and they're able to, and the sonic, the conversations, the soundtracks, the music, all of those choices that make art familiar and relatable. I think they've been at it, and I think they've done it long. They've long done this well, to varying degrees of success with regard to how audiences take it. But I think that, for the longest time, that was where, if you wanted to see Black women on screen, that was where you had to go. So the idea that we have long had them there as these examples of possibility, but because they didn't do it the right way, or they didn't do it in ways that made us feel good about ourselves or smart, or or savvy or celebrated in the ways that we would like, we denigrated it so long to where we forget that they sort of gave us something of a roadmap.
Interesting. So potentially drama can learn a little bit about something from reality.
It does. Empire would not exist without Real Housewives of Atlanta, or Love and Basketball Wives, or Love and Hip Hop. So yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. I don't think I've forgotten anything, have I, Owen, in the chat? Just double checking.
No, everything's been mentioned.
Great. Super. So can I first of all say thank you to Kristen again, and please join me in thanking her. And also I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that our next session will be at 10 a.m. British summertime on Wednesday, the 21st of July, just to let you know that the evening session, which is scheduled for, I think, 4 o'clock as well, will be moved to the 2nd of August. So bear with me as I basically organize the change. In the meantime, thank you very much for attending, and have a wonderful rest of the day, which for some of you will be quite long, where for others it will be involved dinner and bed, basically. So have a good evening. Thank you very much, Kristen.
See y'all later.
That was awesome. Thank you.